Today's modern working professionals expect a learning experience that reflects the world we live in. Canvas LMS is built to help organizations unlock the potential of skill-based learning by focusing on what matters to learners and their educators. From dynamic course delivery to adaptable credentialing, Canvas empowers learners to thrive in a rapidly evolving landscape. See what it's all about at canvas.com.
Welcome to The Accidental Trainer, a podcast where you'll hear firsthand stories and tips on how to start and grow your training career.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of ATD Accidental Trainer Podcast. I'm your host, Alexandria Clapp, and today we have with us G. Riley Mills, COO and co-founder of the Pinnacle Performance Company. Welcome, Gary.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining me. I reached out to you because you were one of our top attended sessions at our international conference in New Orleans. And that made me think the rest of the ATD community, anyone who didn't make it to that conference, would surely want to learn a little bit more about how we can become better storytellers. So we're going to jump into that topic today. But first, I never want to shortchange exploring someone's origin story. So tell us how you landed in your current role and anything accidental that happened along the way.
Absolutely. So my background, before we started Pinnacle Performance Company, so for those of you who don't know, Pinnacle Performance, we're a global communication skills training firm. We train all around the world, 60 countries, Fortune 500 clients. And my background before I started Pinnacle 20 years ago with my co-founder, David Lewis, was my training is as a professional actor. So I came to Chicago when I was 18 years old, studied at one of the best theater schools in the world, did 4 years there, got out, and then worked as an actor in television, film, and theater. All that time, I was also a playwright and a screenwriter. So during that time, I was having plays produced, having plays published. And so storytelling, which is what we're talking about today, is really in my bones since I was about 14 years old. When I was 14, I studied playwriting and storytelling in a church basement in Minneapolis with one of the most prolific playwrights in the United States. He was one of my teachers. There were, I think, 8 of us, 8 teenagers in this session learning storytelling and playwriting. And ironically, one of the other teenagers that was in there at the time was Liz Winstead, who went on to create The Daily Show. So I like to say I got my start with Liz Winstead from The Daily Show when we were teenagers in a church basement in Minneapolis. That's where it all started. Since then, I continue to, when I'm not doing coaching or executive work around the world, I'm writing for TV and film and theater. I mentioned to you right before we went live here, over the last 3 years, I've won 2 Emmy Awards for television programs that I wrote for NBC. It's a combination of, I love the corporate work. I love speaking at ATD, my favorite conference every year. But I also do film and TV, and I'm producing movies and theater in London and in the US. So storytelling is my favorite thing above all. So I'm really glad to talk about that with you today.
So I have some follow-up questions right away because I geek out when anyone
Sure.
says that they were acting or into that. Do you have a favorite play or musical?
That I wrote or that I was in?
Oh, I was just thinking like that you
in general.
Yeah, you didn't have to be in it or write it, but maybe there's a lot.
Yeah, I love all the classics. I was a big Sam Shepard was a playwright, American playwright who I love very much. Joe Orton is a British playwright that was wild and way ahead of his time. I was a big fan of Tennessee Williams, things like Streetcar Named Desire. One of my favorite plays is Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, Edward Albee, just one of the greatest. So there's a lot. I'm certainly inspired by many of those writers, and some of my work you can see is reflective of chasing those giants, chasing those amazing writers.
Do you have another place besides your website where you have, if folks want to see things that you have written too?
Yeah, a lot of my work is published by Dramatic Publishing Company. My theater pieces are there. There's a lot on Google. If you just go YouTube my stuff, you can see a lot of my old clips of old movies and TV shows and things when I was young.
I know it's worth it to go down that little tangent because in the L&D community, there are so many folks who were theater lovers.
So many.
They got a theater major or a theater in dance or something like that. And then they were like, I would like to have a stable financial, for whatever reason, they make it into this field. So I know that that was probably interesting for many of our listeners. Let's jump into our topic, which is kind of funny because there are a lot of theater lovers, people who have had acting backgrounds. They love telling a good story. But one of my curiosities was, okay, yes, storytelling seems really fundamental. It's how we learn and hold on to information, make sense of our relationships with other people. But when I think about everyone I know, I wouldn't necessarily say they are all great storytellers. The one thing that everyone I know has in common is that we're good at storytelling, which it seems like you should be able to say that. That's just a very human natured thing. I thought maybe we start there. Like, why is that? Why is everyone at this ATD conference going to, how do we become better storytellers?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I do agree that in our industry and learning and development, you've got to be able to tell a good story. Stories engage us. They get those mirror neurons firing in our brain. They excite people. They motivate action in others. And I hear your point, but I would actually take a slightly different view on it in that I think people are better storytellers than they think. Because if you think about it, most of our day is spent telling stories. You come home from work and your partner is there and what's the first thing you ask them? How was your day? And they tell their story of the day. They tell whatever the big event was, whether it was good, whether it was bad, whether it was something with the pet or the kid or the client or the boss. They launch into that story. And so we're listening to stories constantly. We're telling stories constantly. And for those of you who love TED Talks, I think the number is something like 65% of the most popular TED Talks of all time. They're popular because they're stories. Good TED Talks are the stories woven through, and then the learning or the tips and the tools, the revelations, that all comes from inside of these stories. So we love TED Talks because of story as well.
Okay, so you're already challenging me to reframe. Okay, I'm going to play devil's advocate here throughout and imagine the people who their spouse would say, well, actually,
not a good storyteller.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So that may be true that we can all be better at storytelling, which is why we have a suite of storytelling products at Pinnacle for that reason in itself. So storytelling for data, subject matter experts who have to present all these learnings, all this data, all this information that's very thick. It's very dense. It's a lot of words on the slides. You've got to be able to tell a story to make me understand why that data is important to me and what you want me to take away from this. So storytelling with data, very important. Storytelling for change is a brand new product we just launched. And it's all about, every industry right now is going through such change since COVID, whether it's work from home, hybrid work, acquiring other companies, downsizing, asking people to do more with less. Storytelling is a good way to help move people through change, to get that buy-in, to get that alignment. And then just storytelling for business impact. That's another very popular session. That's the one that I covered some of that information at the ATD conference this year. That's just the basic storytelling. If somebody walks in going, I'm not a good storyteller, I would love to be, that's the session for you. Because as I write in my books, as we talk about in our trainings, great storytellers are made. You're not born a great storyteller. And there's very simple tools that I can give you, that I can lay out for you, that can make you a better storyteller. So don't be intimidated by, wow, my boss is just the greatest. She's the greatest storyteller ever. I can't even get to be half of that good. You can. You definitely can. And there's some very simple things that you can do.
Okay, there's two things there that I want to follow up on. The first is that you started to break down some examples. I just want to make this really explicit, examples of data and change and business impact. And one of my questions for you was going to be, how do you use storytelling to enhance your communication skills? And it seems like, if you're trying to talk about data, having a story wrapped around it is going to help you make sense of that data better.
Sure.
That seems like you were answering that question. And you and I talked about this. I'm like, we could spend hours talking about why a story is good to have in your communication arsenal. And I think that our listeners want to jump into where you were going, which is that you said great storytellers can be made. They're tuning in and wondering, how do you do that? How do you craft an engaging story?
Yeah, perfect. So if I'm delivering a message to stakeholders, to my team, to my peers, to my client, we got to start with the most important thing, which is, what is my objective? This meeting, this session, this presentation, this conversation, what at the end of it do I want to happen? So you have to identify your objective. What's the goal of this? If it's a performance review situation, you're my boss and I'm coming in for my annual performance review, you've got to figure out, first I've got to analyze that audience. You've got to think about me, your direct report, and say, what are they looking for? What are they, knowing their personality, what do they want out of this? And then if there's any stories that can help move you toward that, that's where stories, they can be really helpful, because we want engagement, we want alignment in any meeting or communication we have at our job. So engagement and alignment, storytelling can help with that. So if you're a subject matter expert, you have these great findings. Is there a story about how this information came about, or what we can do with this information that's going to illuminate it, make me go, got it? Jerome Bruner was the cognitive psychologist who studied creativity and storytelling and found that an audience or a listener is 20 times more likely to remember information if you include it as part of a story that touches them emotionally versus just a number on a slide. A number on a slide generally doesn't have the emotional impact that a story is going to have, simply because human beings are wired for stories. Ever since you go back to the caveman times, hey, there's a terrible creature out there that's going to kill us. Here's what I just saw when I went out there. Those stories saved our lives back then. And so evolutionarily, we just gravitate towards telling and hearing stories.
I have a laundry list of questions.
Let's go.
Are there certain frameworks or archetypes that you follow? And maybe I'm not using the right terminology here.
Yeah, no, you are.
You're like listening, like, yes, I know. I need to tell a story. I have data sitting in front of me. I know my audience. How do I start packaging this? I'm ready to go. What's next?
Great question. So my last book was called The Bullseye Principle. And the quote at the front of our book, co-written by David Lewis, is a quote from Gilbert Arland, who's a writer, who said, when the archer misses the mark, failure to hit the bullseye is never the fault of the target. To improve your aim, improve yourself. So that's how we think of communication or storytelling. Your message, your story is an arrow, and it has a purpose, and that's to hit the bullseye with that listener, with that audience, with that stakeholder. If you don't, it's not their fault. If they don't understand why that story was important to them, what it was about, if they're bored by it, confused by it, that's always on you as the storyteller, as the speaker. The burden of engagement lies with you as the speaker or the storyteller. That is what we teach in the Pinnacle methodology. So when that arrow hits the bullseye, when that story does what it needs to do, it's going to influence emotion and it's going to motivate action in that listener, which is our end goal. We want that story to elicit a feeling, a new belief, a new value. That's the purpose of storytelling, to move us closer to whatever our goal is. When we talk about frameworks, very good question. I talked about when I was 14 years old, when I'd studied playwriting and storytelling in a church basement in Minneapolis, Minnesota. That teacher taught me a framework for storytelling, very simple, that I have used my whole life. I have used it for over 40 years now. And that framework that goes back hundreds of years is also what helped me win 2 Emmy Awards. I will give you that formula right now. And it's in Bullseye Principle. I go into it in more detail. But very simply, it's based off Gustav Freitag, was a German novelist and playwright back in the 1800s. And he was the first person to come up with a formula for dramatic structure, what he called it. It's sometimes called Freitag's pyramid. And it's a very simple little map, and it has 5 points on it. It has 6 points. I like to put 6 on it. It has 5. Sometimes it has 6. In my version, it has 6. And here they are really quickly. Number 1, you got to start with the exposition. Who, what, when, where does this story take place? You got to start by giving that background information. Otherwise, I don't know your Aunt Mary who lives in Gary, Indiana and has 100 cats in her basement. I don't know any of that. So you got to tell me that so you can now tell me the story about how you got a phone call when you were 13 to go live with your crazy Aunt Mary in Gary, Indiana. The first point is the exposition, who, what, when, where. Now, that is the least interesting part of a story generally, or of a movie where we're meeting all the people and establishing relationships. So the lesson there, which I would recommend, is get through that as quickly as you can. And then you're going to get to the second point of the 6 points. That is called your inciting incident. What is an inciting incident? It is also a mechanism on a gun, which is called the trigger. So your inciting incident in a story is the moment that something happens that now we got a story. So the minute you get that phone call from your crazy Aunt Mary in Gary, Indiana, saying she needs someone to come watch her 100 cats for the summer, now we're off to the races. If we don't get that call, we don't have any story. So what is the inciting incident, that trigger moment, that something happens that now we have a story? So that's the second element. Now, the third element is called rising action. That is where most of your story takes place. And if you picture this like a mountain, now we're climbing up the side of the mountain. That's where most of the story happens. This happens, which leads to this, which builds to this, which ratchets the tension, which ratchets the conflict. Now it's getting interesting, twists and turns, revelations, surprises. That is the third element. Now, we get then to the tip, the top of the mountain, the pinnacle. We call that your climax. So the climax of your story, and you have to have one of those. Otherwise, people are very disappointed if it's just a bunch of information. So that climax is the highest point of tension. We've been working to that the whole movie, the whole story. In a Marvel movie, it's the villain pulls their weapon. The hero pulls their weapon. They step out onto the rock ledge with the lava bubbling beneath them, and they fight. Something happens. The bad guy slips. The good guy kicks him in the lava. He falls in, and the world is saved. So that's that climax, the release of tension, where we go, oh, thank goodness. Thank goodness Darth Vader was finally taken down. Thank goodness the Wicked Witch of the West was finally vanquished and we're safe. So that climax answers the question you asked at the beginning in the inciting incident. What is life going to be like when I move to Indiana to stay with my crazy Aunt Mary who has 100 cats I have to watch? The whole story is going to be about that, and you're going to answer that question at the climax. So that is the fourth element. The fifth element is some falling action. So after the climax, after the villain falls in the lava, the lights in the movie theater don't just come up. We still, to have a great story, we still have to wrap things up in a really effective way. So falling action is one or two things that happen after the climax to start winding the action down, start wrapping things up. Keep it tight though, because after that climax, we got not a lot of attention span left. I got to go pay the babysitter. I got to drive all the way home. Let's wrap this thing up, because you just answered the question. The villain's done. There's no more tension. So a couple things in falling action. And then the finale, the final thing is resolution. That's the sixth element. How do we wrap this up? And they all live happily ever after. There's the classic one. Or if you're telling a story about a lesson you learned, and from that day on, I never drove while drunk ever again after that one incident. That was the lesson. So what's the takeaway? What's the lesson? What do you want me to be thinking about that night at dinner after I've heard your story? Is it clear why you told me this story? So if your story follows that framework, that's a great place to start. And then once you get good at Freitag's dramatic structure model, then you can start getting creative. Like Quentin Tarantino, he does not care really about that framework. He'll start in the middle of the story. You don't even know who anybody is. And he's like, you'll figure it out. You'll pick it up. So you can do that once you get comfortable with that original framework. That's a super easy way to just use storytelling. And that's one of the frameworks that we lay out in our books and in our trainings.
I love it. It reminded me of being back in like sixth grade English class.
Sure, absolutely.
You try to make sure you're following along with the plot of the book that you're reading. So that's a good reminder that is actually just still a really good framework to hold on for yourself. Man, I started to think you could use that even if you're designing a training session, or if I'm like designing a podcast conversation. I was like,
narrative is everything. If you're watching what's going on in the politics in the US right now, it's all narrative, right? So for the longest time, Joe Biden and Donald Trump, the narrative was, wow, it's neck and neck, but Biden seems like he's not quite there. He's maybe, is he too old? We're not sure. Then all of a sudden, there's this surprise of, we've never done it before. Let's have an early debate in June or whatever it was. We've never done that before. But the Biden people wanted the narrative of he's too old to be switched, to be changed. And so everybody tuned in to watch to see if that narrative was going to be changed. And not only was it not changed, it was reinforced in a way that the whole script got flipped on its ear. And within, a few weeks, the president steps out and says, I'm not even running. And a new character in the story emerges. And now the narrative is not about Trump's momentum of how he's going to be swept back into office again. It's he's now got a different opponent on his hands. There's some energy there. And he's trying to figure out, how do I now get the narrative back to me? From just an outside perspective, narrative perspective, storytelling perspective, it's fantastic to watch because it's all storytelling.
I want to dig into where people struggle. I'm curious if you notice common challenges. This might not be the right way to think of it, so you can help me reroute my thinking if that's the case. But I'm curious if there's a place where everyone gets stuck with like the climax, like getting to the point, or I'm not sure.
Yeah, so two things. The first, people run into trouble, too much exposition. They start their story and you can feel the audience fidgeting, going, get to the good part. Yeah. Like nothing's happening. This is just a bunch of stuff. So get to your inciting incident faster. So you have that major dramatic question you're asking. I got the paper in the mail. I got the interview request in the mail. And now I have to travel to Washington, D.C. to do this interview with this very important person. How is it going to go? That's the dramatic question. We'll answer at the climax whether I got the job or I didn't get the job. So too much exposition, that's one. You bore people. The second would be just overall too much information. You're not what we call sticking to the channel. You're giving information that's taking me off course, that it's not really important to the forward thrust of the narrative. So remember what your objective is. Here's what I'm trying to get to, and get there in as short amount of time as you can. Neil Gaiman, if anybody has seen his masterclass in storytelling, he's one of the best. He has a really interesting way about brevity and economy of words, where he says, as a storyteller, as a writer, don't think of yourself as getting paid by the word when you're crafting your story. Instead, think of it as you're paying by the word. So the less words you can use, the less it's going to cost you to write this story, which I think is good advice. Every word has to be absolutely essential. Every sentence. If not, cut it. This little part of the story that doesn't serve the forward thrust, get rid of it. We don't need those details that your Aunt Mary used to play bingo at the local thing 5 years before you went to live with her. That's not important. Unless it's revealing character or revealing something about the plot that we need to know because something's going to happen at the bingo parlor. We don't need to know that information. It doesn't serve us. So just really refining it and then preparing those stories ahead of time. I wrote an article for Forbes not too long ago called The 5 Essential Stories Every Business Leader Should Possess. So people can read that for free, but it's all about, you should have these ones in your back pocket. If you're a leader in L&D, if you're a boss, if you're a manager, these are the good ones to have. By the way, one of my favorite ones of the 5 is what we call the pie in the face story, which is a story that we've all got. We've all made a mistake. We screwed up. We miscalculated and we really botched it. But importantly, we learned from it. We took away a lesson. And when we tell that story as a boss or as a leader, it accomplishes a couple things. Number one, it shows humility, that I'm imperfect. As your boss, I'm not always right. I make mistakes sometimes. And here's one that I made a terrible mistake. And more importantly, here's the lesson I learned from that mistake, so you don't make that same mistake. That pie in the face story is really good for a few different reasons. Plus, everybody loves to hear a story about how somebody else screwed up.
We have sessions like that called Fail Jam, where people share their failure stories. It almost goes back to storytelling, right? Because you can swap in yourself in that story.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. You put yourself, or you can go, man, I'm so glad that was her and not me. I would have been terrified if that would have happened to me. If you're in learning and development, or you're a presenter, or you're a trainer, you have to be adept at things going wrong. Technology is going to let you down. You were supposed to speak and work with this group, but the room is booked out to somebody else. Things happen. But one of my favorite stories as a trainer that I tell new trainers, the first time I ever trained in Delaware, this was right before the start of Pinnacle. So I was a fairly green trainer. The night before, I packed my stuff really quickly. I flew to Delaware. Monday morning, I get up, 7 a.m. I start to get dressed for the session with all these executives. And I realized the 2 dress shoes that I had brought were both left shoes. Nothing's open in Delaware at 7 a.m. that I can go buy a pair of shoes before my 9 o'clock start. So I was really in a bad spot. What am I going to do here? I have 1 pair of dress shoes. They are 2 left shoes. And I have to go and establish my credibility in front of a room full of high-level executives who don't necessarily know who I am. So I decided, here's what I'm going to do, because it's really my only option, but let's make some lemonade out of lemons. So what I did was I put those 2 left shoes on. I welcomed everybody in as they came in for the start of this executive coaching session. And it was a full day. I start out, I do my introductions. I'm looking at the audience. No one's noticing anything. And I start to veer into first impressions. One of the first things we talk about, how to create a strong first impression. How observant are we as audience members? Blah, blah, blah. So as I'm talking about first impressions and how observant we are, there was a lectern over to the side. I walked behind the lectern so they can no longer see me waist down. And I said to the audience, do you feel like you as executives are pretty observant? when you're in a room listening to a speaker or running a meeting? And they're like, everybody said yes. Everybody said, yes, I am. I said, great. So we've been together for about a half an hour talking in this session. Have you noticed anything strange about me or out of the ordinary? Everybody's like, no, nothing. I said, you didn't notice that I had 2 left shoes on? And their mouths dropped and they said, you're lying. I said, you don't know that I had 2 left shoes on right now. They said, there's no way. And so I dramatically walked out from behind that lectern and they looked down and they couldn't believe it. I said, so we're talking about first impressions and how observant, how we are taking in the settings and our environment. We're not always as good as we think. And I said, so now that we've established that, I'm going to take these things off and I'm going to put them over here. And I kept going. And that was one of the most memorable aspects of that class. And at the first break, they said to me, do you do that every time? You must do that. And I said, no, I don't. I said, I literally packed too hastily last night. And that was my only. So they loved it. They loved how I brought this problem into the conversation and used it to illuminate an idea that we were talking about in the training.
So where you're going with this, it's funny because my next question that I wanted to shift back to you, when you were talking about purpose and meaning and hitting it with an arrow, you had mentioned the phrase evoking a feeling. So I wanted to come back to emotion and sort of that role and how do you tap into emotion. That feels like the difference between like a good story and a bad story sometimes is emotion. And you were just telling the story. And I was imagining like that feels so memorable and that would stick out to people of like, oh, I am really observant. He did walk back and forth between that desk and lectern like a few times where I cannot believe I didn't see it. You were like, that does evoke emotion. So I feel like this is a good opportunity. Is there a strategy or a way to make sure that you do? I mean, in that instance, it seems like that's a seasoned storyteller trainer that is taking an opportunity like, oh, I can use this. But if you're not used to that, you're not sure how to do that. How do you do that?
Yeah, so it's neuroscience. So when I was writing Bullseye Principle, I had the great fortune of talking to a bunch of neuroscientists and interviewing them because I wanted to know how storytelling and influence and communication, how neuroscience plays into it. And here's the big takeaways neuroscience-wise when it comes to storytelling or communication. As a speaker or storyteller, there's 2 things that we want. I want engagement from my audience. I want them listening. Because if they're sleeping, my story is not going to resonate. But I also want memory. I want it locked in their memory. So when they leave and go to dinner that night with their spouse, they're telling them, oh my gosh, this trainer today came in. You're not going to believe it. He had 2 left shoes on. He did this whole thing. I want that to happen. So engagement and memory. Those are what we want as storytellers. However, they're hard to come by in this day and age because people, if they feel like you're trying to influence them, they put up walls. We call it reactance. Attention spans are getting shorter and shorter, distractions. So when you are crafting a message, when you're crafting a story, there's 2 aspects of it you have to keep in mind in order to accomplish the engagement and the memory. The first is make sure that your information is logical and credible. So that's the first thing, because if it's not credible, it's not logical, it doesn't matter. They're going to tune out. The second thing though, and this is what subject matter experts forget when we train subject matter experts, they think it's all just logic and numbers and facts. As a subject matter expert, I can tell a boring story because it's not about my storytelling, it's about my data, when in fact, it's also about your storytelling. Otherwise, just send me a PDF. Because if you're presenting or communicating, now it's communication. So aside from the logical part, we can't forget about the emotional part. So you've got to create a message that resonates emotionally with that audience because that's how it's going to stick. That's how they're going to remember it 20 times more likely than if it's just a logical data point or number. Knowing my audience, L&D folks who are on this session right now, I told that story specifically because everybody on here has a story like that where they, oh my God, I forgot my clicker. Oh my gosh, my PowerPoints just went down and I didn't know what came next. We all have it. So as I was telling that story, they were doing 2 things. One, they're saying, man, I'm glad I'm not that guy. I'm glad that didn't happen to me. And number 2, they're saying, oh, it reminds me of the time that this happened to me and the lesson I learned from it. So those stories resonate because they're universal. We can all feel the feelings. You probably, as I'm telling the story and realize I only have 2 left shoes, if you're a trainer, your heart might have started to beat a little faster going, oh gosh, what is he going to do? Oh my God, there's no places open in Delaware at 7 a.m. on a Monday. He's screwed. There's no way he's going to get through. What's he going to do? Those questions are fun. How is he going to get through this? How's it going to end up? That's just fun storytelling.
I love that example. I want to go back to something you said about if people feel like you are trying to influence them, they put up walls. I had this like in my notes because we do want to influence other people. The way I had phrased the question. So now I'm thinking about this. I'm like, okay, but I want to help people take action. I want to inspire motivation. So many of our listeners are helping drive change management, whatever it is, helping you change the performance that you are doing in your role. You're doing this thing now, and we would like you to do this other thing. Their work is influencing others. I'm curious what kind of advice you have for when that is your goal and you want to be upfront that you're influencing it. How do you do it in a way where you're not going to put up people's walls?
Yeah, it goes back to that busting through that wall of reactance. So you've got to analyze your audience. That's where everything that Pinnacle does, every training we do, every article I write, every book, every speaking gig I do, I'm starting with who is this audience? What's important to them? And how do I deliver on that thing that's important to them? So starting there, I think is helpful. Preparation, being prepared, I think is very important. Another simple structure when you're trying to get alignment, trying to get buy-in, overcome an objection is anecdotes. So past, present, future, that's one of the structures, one of the formulas for effective anecdotes. If you don't have time in this performance review or in this meeting to tell an entire story, you can do past, present, future to make your point. Let me give you a quick example. So I have two daughters, 24 and then 21. And I did a TED Talk in China a few years back. And the opening of my TED Talk, which is called Are We Killing Communication? I tell the story about how my older daughter and I were cleaning out her closet in her bedroom, and she found my pager from 1989. And she asked, what the heck is this thing? And so I told her what it did. And at the end of it, she said, wait a second, let me understand this. So what this electronic device would do is it would tell you someone's trying to reach you, but it wouldn't tell you who it was. It wouldn't tell you what they wanted. And if you wanted to call them back, you couldn't use that device to do that. I said, that's exactly right. And her question was, why would anybody even want that? What good was that? And I said, that was the technology of 1989. That's all we had. And so using a past, present, future anecdote, I could talk to my daughters about technology in this way. I could say, hey, look, when I grew up, there was no cell phones, no pagers, no computers, no laptops, no internet. So we went out with our friends after school. And as long as we were back before the lights came on, our parents were happy. That was communication back in the 1970s and 80s. Now, that was the past. Today, everybody's got a smartphone in their pocket. And guess what? I can get a hold of you at any point. I can text you. I can check. I can follow you. I know where you're going. It's a much different world today in the present. Now, in the future, this could be a problem because we could be tracked too much. Some would argue we're tracked too much now, but in the future, bet on it to know where we are, what we're doing. They're going to see what we're buying, how long we're lingering in front of a product before we move on to something else, what we buy because we didn't buy that one, to figure out the data there. And so that's where technology is going, maybe to a scary place where we're tracked too much. There's too much information. There's too much data. And so that's just the past, present, future formula to tell a quick anecdote about technology.
To stay on the theme of technology a bit, I can't help but throw in the conversation of AI and what your thoughts are. Is it possible to collaborate with AI to have compelling storytelling?
I love that question. And so my daughter works for a market research firm out of San Francisco, and we were talking about ChatGPT. And obviously younger people, they love technology. They're really comfortable with it, all the tools. Some of us who are not as young as the Gen Z folks, I got to be honest, as a writer, when I first experienced ChatGPT, it was a little terrifying. I literally, just to try it the first time I went on, I said, write an article about collaboration in the voice of G. Riley Mills, thinking it's going to come back saying, I don't know who that is. Instead, in less than a second, it pitched an article back to me, quoting me. I was shocked by it. And so I think there are ways to collaborate, ethically and morally. It's tricky. What I love it for right now, collaborating with AI, is if I have a couple sentences that I can't quite get it right, the pieces aren't fitting together, my thought is not as clear as I want, and I've tried everything, I will put that through ChatGPT to say, fix this for me, please. The other thing, do you do this? Because my daughter and I found out separately, we do this. When you use ChatGPT, do you say please like it's a person? Because I'm scared when the robots take over. I want to be on their good side. That's what my daughter and I decided. But I find myself, because it's it feels like a sentient being almost. It feels like a robot that's smart enough to be respected. I say, could you please improve this? Which feels strange, but I do it.
Right. Even though it's not a sentient and doesn't have that reasoning ability, it is based off of human language. And so you're using something that works when you're talking with a real human. If I'm polite to you and use manners and nice etiquette as a human being, I'm probably going to get a better response. So that seems to work better with AI as well. Well, so that's interesting. So that you do think that there's an opportunity there to at least collaborate, but it doesn't sound like you're using it to do the work for you.
No, for sure. And I've been really interested talking to my professor friends or my teacher friends who the kid had 2 weeks to write a book report on Robinson Crusoe. They didn't write it. It's the night before. ChatGPT is probably going to be pretty tempting to that kid who procrastinated. How does that fit into our world as a teacher?
I have heard Carl Kopp tell stories of teachers who are bringing AI into the lessons or assignments strategically, knowing kids are going to use it. So then maybe that's a starting point. And then you need to edit AI's work, know what it's missing or how to write a better prompt. So at least there's something there.
But I would be very sad if writing skills become something that get lazy or rusty or are no, like cursive writing. I just don't use it. It feels like it's falling away for the younger generations. But the ability to write and have coherent thoughts and a clear narrative and make a point succinctly and use language, I would be really sad if 25 years from now or 20 years or 10 years, that's not something that anybody cares about anymore because we've got AI that can write it perfectly.
Maybe it'll be one of those things where people have a backlash and they come back to it. I hear so many folks who describe writing. We're talking about storytelling, but you keep bringing up writing because writing is part of that storytelling process, making sense of that story, whether you're physically writing it out in a notepad or typing it out in your notes app, or you're talking to yourself out loud and telling the story in your head. It's still this process of writing. So I know we could keep talking about this forever and ever, but I think you have shared some really, really great strategies and nuggets with us today. So thank you so, so much. I want to get back to focusing on you. What are your current learning goals right now?
Fantastic question. So I'm heading over to Europe and to India I'll be over for a month doing a series of speaking engagements and coaching sessions. My goal is it's been 6 months since I was over there doing the last one. And so to bring some of the latest and greatest things that I've been working on and sharing those and trying some of those out. I always have 2 or 3 books. You're probably the same way going on at the same time. Right now, I really love You're Not Listening, which is a great book. Kate Murphy, I believe, is the author. Really good book. The Anxious Generation, Jonathan Haidt, that's another really good book and terrifying if you have kids, because it talks about what's happening to our attention and to our anxiety because of screens and what young people are experiencing. So I love talking about that, how it relates to communication, but I'm always working on new curriculum and trying to bring the latest and greatest to my speaking gigs and to the Pinnacle training for our clients.
Awesome. Well, how can folks continue to keep up with you and your activity?
Yeah, so feel free to link in with me. I'm on LinkedIn under G. Riley Mills. Pinnacle Performance Company, link in with Pinnacle. If you have questions about training or our books or our company or our coaching, you can either reach out to me directly or you can go to info@pinper.com and we're happy to help you out. Yeah, and the article I mentioned on the 5 stories that every leader should possess, if you want that as a PDF, just link in with me and just say, can you send that to me? And I will be happy to send you that document so you have all that information.
Thank you so, so much. It was such a pleasure to chat with you today.
Thank you. You as well.
Thank you to our sponsor, Canvas by Instructure.
Thanks for listening to this podcast from the Association for Talent Development. Be sure to check the show notes for resources mentioned in today's episode. And if you found the show useful or insightful, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share it with a colleague.